Good evening, and thank you all for joining us for our True Talk Thursday vodcast, the platform that encourages a thought-provoking conversation about topics centered around education. What's so neat about the vodcast is that you'll hear opinions, experiences, research, and ideas from various perspectives, but I want to remind you all that the views and opinions expressed tonight do not necessarily reflect that of Alas or NABSI. Now driving the conversation tonight, we have Dr. Maria Armstrong, who is the Executive Director of Alas, and Dr. Atiba-Weza, who is the Executive Director of NABSI, driving the conversation. And so Maria and Atiba, take it away.
It's great to have everyone here tonight. And we are so happy to have Doctora Cristina Mora. She is an Associate Professor of Sociology, Chicano Latino Studies by courtesy, and the co-director of the Institute of Governmental Studies at UC Berkeley. Her first book, Making Hispanics, is based on her research, which focuses mainly on questions of census, racial classification, immigration, and racial politics in the U.S. This book was published by the University of Chicago Press and provides the first historical account of the rise of the Hispanic/Latino pan-ethnic category in the United States. Mora has received numerous awards of her scholarship, including the 2018 Early Career Award from the section on racial and ethnic minorities at ASA. In April of 2020, she helped to oversee the largest survey on COVID-19 and racial disparities in California and published some of the first policy briefs and academic articles on the subject. She is currently working on her second book, California Color Lines, which examines contemporary racial attitudes and politics in California. Welcome, Doctora Cristina Mora. So good to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Maria and Atiba. It's great to be here.
So, there's been, like I was, saying in the intro, that there's been much ado about using the label or / term LatinX. So, let's just jump right in and start talking about its origin and, who is credited as introducing it to el mundo, right? To the world. Because I'll tell you, the conversations that just Atiba and I have, it's like, I shared with him. When I first heard it, I thought, is it because it's a new generation coming up? And then someone else was quick to tell me, no, it's about gender neutrality. And I'm like, mira, this is happening within my own familia. We gotta get a conversation going. So with that, what do you know about who's credited and who introduced it to the world?
Yeah, I think, it's better to think of, what communities use it instead of like what one specific person or office or, idea started it all. In part because if you look at the history of Latinx or Latinos in the United States, we've never been able to pin down the first person that used Hispanic, or the one person that said it should be Hispanic, or the other person that said, these are, this is not how identity and identity labels work. They're like a groundswell, right? They often come in times from the way people are seeing themselves in their local communities and in their contemporary time periods, like Chicano, Chicana. You can't say there wasn't one person that wrote the first poem or things like this. Yeah. These often have long histories. Now, there is a moment that we can sort of think about as researchers and as scholars about when it sort of takes on, when it takes a life, when it takes off, when it becomes part of the political imaginary, part of our sort of understanding of who we are or subsets of who we are in the community. And just like Chicano took off, it doesn't mean that all Mexican Americans think or use the label of Chicano. In fact, it's actually not incredibly popular amongst the Mexican American population, but we know that exists. And we know that for some people, it gives them true meaning. That's a way we might think about the term Latinx, at least right now. Depending on how you want to look at it, if you look at it as a Google search term, we know that it was being used as early as the early 2000s, 2005, for example. People were looking picking up things like Latinx. But it wasn't really until about 2015, 2013 that folks really started to debate and give meaning to the idea of Latinx. And if I were to say what sort of sets of people were the first to use this, I would undoubtedly say it's the youth. Undoubtedly say it was college students, sort of the younger subset of millennials right now, or the sort of Generation Z, that we're really debating and understanding, can we have a term that escapes the gender binary? So it is, in many ways, both things are true, Maria, of what you've heard, that it was sort of championed and sort of popularized as a thing amongst Latino youth. And it was connected very intimately to ideas about gender politics. When we think about the youth, we've got to think about, unlike me, they went to, they were in high school, they were in grade school, and they had terms like non-gender binary, cisgender. Did you have cisgender in your school when you were growing up? Did you even know the word? Non-gender binary? Was that even? See, not for you, not for me, but for many folks in their late 20s right now, in their early 20s right now, they grew up at this time. And, I grew up in the 1980s, and, as someone, a child born in the 1980s, or the early 1980, I also have a sense of how momentous the shift towards understanding sexuality politics different really mattered, at least for me, for my friends, for my community. The idea that, two moms could form a family, two dads can form a family, that was big for me and growing up. And that really marked my young adulthood as sort of that change in politics, right? For this new younger generation of Gen Z, it goes beyond that. That's not enough. It goes also about sort of recognizing transgender, cisgender, non-gender identities. And I think that the term, the Latinidad becomes a place for which to wrestle with this, in part because, the terms are just gendered. You've got Latina or you got Latino, and you've got nothing else, right? And so how do you sort of come to terms with that in the era of, much more enlightened set of politics about who we can be as humans and what we can call ourselves? And so if you look at the data of who's calling themselves Latinx and who's really using it, there's a really strong sort of, younger millennial, Gen Z sort of aspect to it. But if you also look at the data, in fact, we've asked it in California surveys, and we find, in California, 1 out of 4 folks are using of the Latino community are using Latinx. Now, we also find that it doesn't mean that they're using Latinx and saying, to hell with Latino, or we don't like Hispanic or anything. We find that it's not, this simple formula of one subtracts another. We find that, people are complex. They've got different spaces that they represent themselves. So like myself, for example, in some places I can say I'm Chicana, in other places I say I'm Latina, and still other places I use the term Latinx often. We are allowed to be that complex. We are allowed to do that, in part because we are a dynamic community. A good amount, a quarter to a third of us are coming in from new countries, our first generations. We're dynamic. And every year, those countries from which we're being represented are becoming more and more diverse. And so with the Latino community, and you see how big, how diverse, and how dynamic, it doesn't surprise me that we would have different labels to describe ourselves. Yeah.
You touch on, obviously the big umbrella of it all, right? And as you were talking, people are complex, let alone a segment of the population. And the whole, labeling, I just finished talking to some folks and I said, yes, my name is Maria de la Luz, Alvarez, Hernandez, Chavez Armstrong, because I threw it all in, right? And then I started thinking, and it's like, you talk about the label of using certain, when you feel like you can use it. Does that mean also that it could be as simple as it's so gender specific, Latino, Latina. Would we get to a point then that you can even change that, whether you're a man or a woman? Like, we're going to get away from that? Is that something that this kind of promotes, or promotes, at least provokes the thinking behind that? If Latinos can do that and kind of dissolve the gender piece of it, let alone that it, like you said, it's a groundswell from the youth. Do you see that having any kind of, I don't know, I guess, ground swell, like you said?
Gender categories are very thoroughly institutionalized in the world and in this country. And this, I think, for the proponents that like the idea of Latinx or promote it, is a way in which we can recognize the language that we use as having power, and having the power of exclusion and the power of inclusion, right? And I think that's where the sentiment comes from. I don't think it necessarily comes from the sentiment that, you know, everybody's going to suddenly start switching or things like that. I think it comes from more of a sense that our language can exclude folks, but at the same time, we can change that, and we have the power to include. One way that folks have been sort of grappling with this, and you see it a lot in the written literature, is they'll say, you know, we've now for a very long time say things like Latina, Latino, or A-O, right? And now we're saying A/O/X.
Yep.
And that's just another way of doing it. And so in many ways, that's a way of recognizing that folks have gender identities, if they choose, in the traditional binary, and they're really attached to them. Like, Latina feminism really means something and has a sense and an opportunity for expression of one's true self, you know, Latina. And at the same time, the terms that we use don't have to be exclusionary. And so I think that what we're seeing is a real opportunity to then come and talk about intersectionality of gender, intersectionality of sexuality, intersectionality of race and ethnicity, and what that means. You know, I personally see it as much more of a term of possibilities, right? And the way that I've seen the data that folks use it, and then at other times they express, you know, Latina or Latino and things like that, it makes me think, why are we so stuck on just one label? Why is it somehow crazy making and sort of a sense that you know, maybe we don't got it together or something like that, the way I've seen elsewhere, or like nobody's ever going to use this or things like that. When it's not true. If you look at Gen Z, like, it depends how you ask the question. If you tell people, do you prefer Latino or Latinx? You know, most people will say, you know, Latino, because we know it. It's been institutionalized. People call us that. People don't necessarily call us Latinx, right? Yeah. And many times when you're saying Latinx, you're saying a personal politics of inclusion sometimes, I think, one would argue. And so I think it'll become part of our lexicon. If you look at the Gen Z data, the Gen Z's data is showing 50%, at least in California, are using the term and especially in the second generation. And especially if you're attuned to politics and things like that, you're much more to use it. And so, you know, I think anytime a new term comes into place, there's a sense of both, there's an opportunity, and the opportunity can be that it gives others a sense of threat. But the opportunity can also be a real important moment to come back and to think about who we are and what our values are and what we can express. And I think historically, you know, Latinos in this country have long showed that even if we use, you know, you just said you're Maria de la Luz, Chavez, you just gave me 4 different things. If Latinos in history wanted to say, we're Spanish speakers, we're Latin American, we're Chicano, we're Mexican, we're this, we have that whole thing too, right? As community. And I think that's okay, right? Yeah. And I think we should think about, like, what is the problem with other folks or with ourselves, sort of, you know, believing that such a dynamic community needs to just stick to one mode of expression. You know?
Awesome. Atiba, what you got for her?
Yeah. Not necessarily chomping at the bit, but What are some of the implications for practice as public educators? I recall as a classroom teacher quite a while back in New York City,
Not that
encouraging,
far back. Come on now.
telling a parent who wanted her son to be fluent in English to the point that they weren't speaking Spanish in the home. And I said, Spanish exclusively in the home, English in school. Make sure you're bilingual. Here we are in 2021 at the cusp of African American History Month. And we went through the same thing from Negro to other words that were not so complimentary to where we are now. What are some of the implications for practice as educators in terms of the importance of our cultural identity, how we are called, how we prefer to be called, how people refer to us, and what that really means most of our students who come to our institutions in terms of what you just said?
Yeah, I think it's got tremendous importance. In one part, I think of just what a tremendous role teachers play in the lives of, the Latino K through 12 population. A tremendous role. I mean, you all don't even know, right? I go back and think my parents didn't go to college. In fact, my mom, I think went to 10th grade, and my dad, stopped even before 3rd grade, right? And so growing up, the only people that I knew that had a college degree that were professionals were the teachers. Mm-hmm. The teachers thus had this amazing role in our lives, or in my life, and in the lives of many young Latinos, as the example of social mobility for us, the example of sort of making it, the example of what we could be, right? Latinas are one of the fastest growing populations in California, in sort of amongst California teachers. And one is this dedication and passion to give back. Another reason is also, this is the model of what we knew. This is the model. Mm-hmm. These are the professionals that we knew that touched us in our daily lives, right? And if your parents are immigrants, there is a sense of, this is also the example of Americanness, right? This is how to make it here and how to contribute to ourselves here. So I say all that to say, you wield such incredible cultural power. I'm sure you all know this, but you wield so much power to shape the sense of who we are, who we think we should be, how we should be in this country, especially if you're touching the lives of children who are first in their family to start navigating the school system in this country. And in that, then you have the real possibility of telling us that the different labels that we want to use for ourselves are okay. I think that's super important, that they're okay, that there's no right or wrong, that if you want to call yourself cisgender, if you want to think of yourself as transgender, there's that space. And I think there's a real then sort of opportunity for you all to think of how to model inclusion, how to model what an inclusive society and an inclusive America that, is often incredibly exclusive can be like. Mm-hmm. And it starts also with the power of sort of the words that you use and your ability to feel comfortable with different expressions of sexuality, gender identity, and label usage that we use. So I think of it that way. I just also think of just how incredibly important teachers are for, teaching us about sort of American practices, especially in an immigrant household where, things like sort of, what is it, at least for me, what is it like to know somebody that's middle class? What is it like to know something, somebody that's educated that sort of made it? For me, growing up, you all were my only teachers. You all were my only mom. That's a lot of pressure. But then it's also a great opportunity.
Yeah, and that's such a great question, Atiba, because, just as Cristina says, the potential, right? The power, the responsibility that teachers have to shape that whole notion of inclusiveness, the comfortability of being able to be in that space are so critical, that I think about, you know, what we probably, what prompts us to want to have like this kind of a discussion is that we probably feel, if, as a teacher, are we even equipped, knowledgeable enough to understand that? Like, how is that being taught to our teachers to create those environments, to have a solid understanding of when is it appropriate to call a person Black versus African American? When is it appropriate to call a person Hispanic or Latinx or Latino or Chicano or whatever the terms are, the labels? So sometimes you don't even deal with it if you don't know how, right? So with that, we're gonna take a pause for the cause here, and we'll be back to have a little more conversation about a whole lot of Latinx.
Hey there, and don't forget, if you like what you hear and want to gain some more insight into what school districts are facing now, then tune in every Thursday at 7 p.m. or subscribe below. We thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great night.